Listo, cuando gusten.
Ok. Bueno, pues muy buenos días en este día nublado en la Ciudad de México, un día en el que acaba de pegar un fuerte huracán en las costas de Oaxaca y que se está dirigiendo hacia, hacia Guerrero. Y hemos estado en el país muy pendientes de eso, pero pues aunque sea aquí un día nublado, es un día agradable. Y pues les damos la más cordial bienvenida a esta, si no me equivoco, 53 sesión, ¿sí? ¿Es cierto?
58.
Siempre me equivoco. 58 sesión de nuestro seminario permanente de antropología e historia de los racismos, las discriminaciones y las desigualdades, coordinado por Cristina Masferrer, aquí presente, representando a la Dirección de Estudios Etnohistóricos de Lina, y por mi persona, representando al CEICH de la UNAM y también a Surge de la UNAM, y pues Cristina y yo ambas somos integrantes de este seminario sobre racismo y xenofobia de la UNAM. Quiero también dar la más cordial bienvenida a nuestro destacado invitado del día de hoy, el doctor Joseph Graves Jr. Yo no lo voy a presentar porque quien lo va a presentar es la doctora Sara Abel, que nos va a hacer favor hoy de moderar esta sesión y que, bueno, es mucho más conocedora de los temas de la relación entre la ciencia, las ciencias de la vida y el racismo, y que también es miembro de nuestro seminario UNAM Surge. Em, Quiero decirles que, bueno, primero viene muy brevemente la doctora Sara Abel, es doctora en Antropología Social y Etnología por la Escuela de Estudios Superiores de París. Es investigadora en el Instituto de Investigaciones Filosóficas de la UNAM y, como les digo, se integró a nuestro seminario UNAM el año pasado. Muchas gracias, Sara, por aceptar moderar esta sesión. Quiero dar también las gracias a Luis de Lina, que va a asegurar la transmisión por redes sociales, notablemente por YouTube. Hay gente que se va a estar conectando por YouTube y creo que Facebook también, no estoy segura, o solo YouTube, no sé, Luis, Cristina, no sé. Y al rato vamos a decir cuántas personas van a estar conectadas a través de este Zoom y cuántas personas van a estar conectadas vía las redes sociales de Lina. Y bueno, como saben, esta sesión pues normalmente dura 3 horas. El doctor Graves va a tener la libertad, como es nuestro único invitado, pues de dar una charla muy relajada y con el tiempo que él decida tomarse para, para exponer. Y después, con tranquilidad, haremos los comentarios, las preguntas, las respuestas. Si dura menos de 3 horas, está bien. Si dura 3 horas, espero que nuestros invitados, nuestro invitado de hoy, también Sara, y quien está aquí como público, estén de acuerdo con eso y participen. Y bueno, le doy la palabra a Jimena Rodríguez, la secretaria técnica de Surge, para que ella nos hable un poquito de la dinámica del día de hoy, sobre todo porque estamos ya teniendo traducción simultánea al inglés y entonces ella nos va a explicar bien cómo opera esto. Muchas gracias.
Pues muy bien, bienvenidas todas las personas que nos acompañan. Como algunas veces ya hemos hecho, vamos a tener traducción simultánea por Zoom, igual y ya se la saben. Si no, recuerden que abajo, en la barra de las opciones de abajo del Zoom, tenemos un icono que es como un pequeño globo. Ahí es donde pueden elegir el canal en donde quieren escuchar el idioma original, es decir, a Joseph hablando en inglés, o pueden elegir en español la traducción de las intérpretes, que hoy nos acompaña Mayra y también nos acompaña, ay, perdón, se me fue aquí su nombre, Jennifer. Sí. Entonces, les agradecemos muchísimo a ellas por su esfuerzo a lo largo de esta sesión, por permitirnos acceder a esto en distintos idiomas. Entonces, bueno, nada más para quienes nos acompañan en YouTube, si quieren estar aquí en el Zoom, acuérdense que en su enlace de registro viene el enlace de Zoom, o también en el correo de recordatorio que yo les envío viene el enlace de Zoom por si se quieren mudar a esta plataforma y tener la traducción simultánea. Cualquier duda, les dejé unas instrucciones en el chat y también pueden preguntarme cualquier cosa y yo estaré atenta. Eso es todo respecto a la traducción.
Okay, thank you so much, Olivia and Jimena, for those general introductions to the seminar and for the instructions. So hopefully everyone's able to hear this fine in Spanish or English. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Joseph L. Graves, Jr. is Mackenzie Scott Endowed Professor of Biology at North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University. He received his PhD in Environmental, Evolutionary and Systematic Biology from Wayne State University in 1988, making him the first Black American to receive a doctorate in evolutionary biology. In 1994, he was elected as a Fellow of the Council of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And since 2024, his recent honors include a Genius Award, which he received from the Liberty Science Center, an Outstanding Alumnus Award for Public Service from Oberlin College, where he received his undergraduate. So I think someone's got their microphone open. If everyone could just quickly make sure that they've closed their microphones apart from Joseph and me. Sorry about that. So he received an Outstanding Alumnus Award for Public Service from Oberlin College, where he received his undergraduate degree in biology. He was invited to give the 12th Petrusky Lecture by the Council for the Advancement of Science Writing last June. And he was the recipient of the W.W. Howells Award for Best Book in Biological Anthropology, presented by the American Association of Anthropologists in November 2024. He's the Director of Genomic Research and Data Science Center for Computation and Cloud Computing, which is part of the US National Institutes for Health. He's Associate Director of Precision Microbiome Engineering, which is a National Science Foundation Engineering Research Center. And he's Director of North Carolina Amgen Biotech Experience, which is an innovative science education program that builds bridges between schools and real-life biosciences. Joseph's research focuses on the evolutionary genomics of adaptation, but for many years, he's also been a vocal advocate for anti-racist readings of evolutionary biology, and he's dedicated much of his writing to offering the public tools for understanding how biological science can and should be used to debunk racism. He's the author of A Voice in the Wilderness, a pioneering biologist explains how evolution can help us solve our biggest problems, which was published by Basic Books in 2022. Along with Alan Goodman, he's also published Racism, Not Race, Answers to Frequently Asked Questions, which was published by Columbia University Press
Ahora,
in
pues en este caso
2022.
vamos a averiguar que no se vengan.
And
Si no se ven, si no se vienen,
I'm getting
pues ya les sigo,
another
¿vale?
voice coming through my
Entonces ahora lo que
microphone.
vamos a hacer es,
Okay, yeah.
I think it's okay now.
Sarah, you are muted now.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I think, okay, just a reminder for everyone to keep their microphones closed, please. So he's also the author of The Emperor's New Clothes, Biological Theories of Race at the Millennium, from Rutgers University Press 2005, and The Race Myth, Why We Pretend That Race Exists in America by Dutton Press, also 2005. And he has more books in the pipeline, including 70, Why Medicine Gets Race Wrong, the harms it causes, and how to fix it, which is currently in preparation with Columbia University Press. And to add to that already impressive list, Joseph has also served on the Racial Reconciliation and Justice Commission, the COVID Vaccination Task Force of the Episcopal Diocese of North Carolina, and as science advisor to several theological seminaries through the American Association for the Advancement of Science, Dialogues of Science, Ethics, and Religion program. So thank you so much for being here today, Joseph. And as you were reminding us just before we started recording, this is also Juneteenth in the United States. It's the day to remember the abolition of slavery in the United States. So we're just extremely honoured and pleased to have you here to talk with us. And I believe your talk today is going to be about anti-racism in scientific work. So I'll hand over the microphone to you.
Okay. Thank you for the very gracious introduction and for being invited to speak before this august body of scholars today. So you've heard about my life. It's recounted in this work. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time because it was a very, how shall I say, complete introduction. I do want to talk about a paper that was published in Nature earlier this year, which talks about the struggles, particularly of historically Black universities in the United States. These universities enroll predominantly students of African descent from not only the United States, but across the African diaspora. But we have been and are still financially shackled by underfunding from the former Confederate states, those that held human beings in bondage, and that Juneteenth now celebrates the end of. The new book, which will be coming out in October, November, title has changed. It's now entitled Why Black People Die Sooner, What Medicine Gets Wrong About Race and How to Fix It. That's Columbia University Press, and the digital version will be available in October. The hard copy will be available in November. So you've also heard about the books that I've written about race and the awards and accolades for those, so we don't need that slide either. I've also been told that you know my good colleague and friend, Dr. Alan Goodman, who has spoken at this seminar in the past, so we don't need to spend a lot of time on that slide either. Okay, well, that one's so anyway, but the purpose of Racism Not Race was to provide concise and accessible answers to questions about race and racism. Now, Alan and I received these questions from conversations that we had with our students, educators, policymakers, friends, and families over 30 years. The book was designed for people who want to work towards human equity and for readers that were nervous about saying the wrong thing. Now, in many cases, the two groups overlap, so we wanted to write the book in a question-answer format. In the United States, and I've also found across my career that in the rest of the world, there is still ongoing confusion concerning the meaning and significance of human biological variation in relation particularly to disease predisposition. Now, for this group, some of the most relevant chapters in Racism Not Race were Chapter 1, What is Race, Racism, and Human Biological Variation? Chapter 2, How did race come to be and why it is still so important? 3, Everything you wanted to know about genetics and race. 5, Why do races differ in disease incidence? 6, life history, aging, and mortality. 7, athletics, bodies, and abilities. 8, races, brains, and behaviors. And chapter 10, DNA and ancestry testing. Now, I, of course, encourage you to read the entire book, but those are ones that I think are particularly useful for this audience. Now, the statement, race is not a scientific concept, has become a platitude amongst the humanities and social science. And quite frankly, the statement is wrong. And it's wrong because it fails due to its conflating two very different concepts: the biological race concept and the socially constructed, socially defined race concept. Now, clearly, the two concepts are related to each other, but they have very different intellectual histories, and it's very important, particularly for scholars in the anthropology, the social sciences, and the humanities, to understand the differences between the two intellectual histories. Now, the biological race concept actually begins in the Western world in the context of Christian theology. And its first two variants, first, what individuals look like, morphology, phenotype, and second, where they were found, geographical location, were entirely within the framework of Christianity. It was called natural philosophy, and these ideas of biological race don't become associated with evolution until after the publication of On the Origin of Species, which occurred in the middle of the 19th century, and really doesn't come to full fruition until the 20th century, where it is associated with population-based or frequency of genes. And then later in the 20th century, when it is associated with phylogenetic methods as to whether any group within a species can be considered a unique evolutionary lineage. Now, this is dramatically different from the socially constructed, socially defined race concept. This arbitrarily utilizes aspects of morphology, geography, culture, language, religion, but only does so in the service of a social dominance hierarchy, and therefore is only relevant to discussions of human beings. Biological race concept, in fact, has been applied to any species that have biparental inheritance. But socially constructed, socially defined race is only ever been used in the context of social dominance of human beings. That is why Alan and I argued that these concepts came into existence via the medium of colonialism, racism, and slavery. Now, from this, you should recognize that our species, anatomically modern humans, does not contain biological races. And I'm going to explain that in the conversation that we are about to have. Now, I also want to be clear. The non-existence of biological races is not the same as saying there are not geographically based genetic differences in human populations. That is entirely true. Human beings differ in their physical attributes. That is entirely true. But whether that genetic variation rises to the level at which we can say that we really are looking at biological races, that is where it is not true. So genetic variation, geographically based, is true, but population-based or cladistic races do not exist in our species, and they never have. Now, also, the socially defined race concept is historically and culturally fluid. meaning it has changed in different nations, in different cultures, and in different time periods. Now, currently in the United States, we recognize the following categories of socially defined race: American Indian or Alaska Native. These refer to individuals with origins in any of the original peoples of North, Central, and South America. Asian, individual with origins in any of the original peoples of Central, East Asia, Southeast Asia, or South Asia. Black or African American, individuals with origins in any of the Black racial groups of Africa. Hispanic or Latino. Now, this is really an ethnic grouping as opposed to a socially defined race. This includes individuals of Mexican, Puerto Rican, Salvadorian, Cuban, Dominican, Guatemalan, and other Central or South American. And the key thing is whether the individual's native language was Spanish. So therefore, in the United States, people from Brazil do not count as Hispanic because the language spoken there is Portuguese. Middle Eastern or North African, individuals with origins in any of the original peoples of the Middle East or North Africa. Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, individuals with origins in any of the original peoples of Hawaii, Guam, Samoa, or other Pacific Islands. And finally, white, individuals with origins in any of the original peoples of Europe. Now, I want to point out that there are real problems with these categories, but remember that they are socially defined. First and foremost, none of these specify exactly how much ancestry one has to have in these groupings to remain in that grouping. So, for example, and I will explain this later, people who are defined as African American, particularly those who are the descendants of enslaved people in the Americas, have both European and African ancestry, but yet they are defined by these categories as Black or African American. Note that the only group that doesn't have a geographical description are those called white, even though these people, in fact, are both those who come from Europe, even though Middle Eastern and North Africans are just as phenotypically white as the people who are in the white category, which refers to people from predominantly Northern, Central, and Eastern Europe. Now, in the United Kingdom, you see very different categories. For example, Asian or Asian British. This includes Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Chinese, or any other Asian background. Black, Black British, Caribbean, or African. Caribbean, African, or any other Black British, or Caribbean background. Mixed or multiple ethnic groups. So they are distinguished white and Black Caribbean, white and Black African, white and Asian, any other mixed or multiple ethnic background. White, English, Welsh, Scottish, Northern Irish or British, Irish, Gypsy or Irish traveler, Roma, or any other white background. And then other ethnic group, Arab or any other ethnic group. Now, in Brazil, not too long ago, as in 2000, there were at least 11 racial categories based upon the intersection of skin color and physical features. So, Preta, dark with African features. Escura, less dark, African features. Negra, darkest, African features. Sarara, light, African features. Parda, light, less African features. Clara, lighter, less African features. Branca, lightest, African features. Morena escura, dark, European features. Mulata, dark, more European features. Morena, dark, still more European features. And finally, Morena Clara, light European features. Now, today in Brazil, the classification has been simplified to Pardo, brown, mixed race, Preto, black, Branco, white, Amarelo, Asian, and Indio, Indian native. Now, Mexico and much of Latin America has used very different racial classification schemes. For example, Mexico really recognizes only one national racial category, and that is mestizaje. Hey, and sorry for my mispronunciation. This category emphasizes the, quote, miscegenation of European and indigenous Native Americans. Yet being more European is associated with higher social status. Europeanness is defined by cultural practices and language use, but there is also stratification by skin color. So now, those were socially defined human groupings. And to understand why they don't match our underlying human genetic biological diversity, we need to know something about how our species populated the planet. Now, our species, anatomically modern humans, left Africa around 100,000 years ago. Now, the species itself is only about 300,000 years ago, old. And as you can see from the diagram here, it populated the globe in a series of migrations that ended up losing genetic variability as groups migrated. And this was because not all the people who were present in these populations chose to migrate to different regions of the world. Now, another way of thinking about this is recognizing exactly how short this period is with regard to the conditions that we understand today. So if we view the life of our species as a calendar year, then it has its origin on January 1st. But no modern humans leave Africa until June 2nd. So then the first human migrants arrive in New Guinea around August 22nd. Some arrive in Europe in September 17th. And I want to point out that modern ancient DNA research has shown that the modern humans that arrived in Europe in September of the year still had African features. The Iceman dies in the Alps on December 1st. Now, Ötzi, the Iceman, has also been shown to have had dark skin. Agriculture begins in the Middle East on December 4th. So we have the Black Death in Europe on December 29th in the morning. The transatlantic slave trade, which created the populations which now exist in the Western Hemisphere, on December 29th in the afternoon. The Industrial Revolution occurs on December 29th in the evening. We don't have cardiovascular disease as a prevalent cause of death in humans until December 30th. The nuclear age begins on December 31st in the morning, and we experience the beginning of the obesity epidemic in the United States on December 31st in the afternoon. Now, to understand how humans have changed their gene frequencies during that great migration, we have to quickly understand forces in populations that allow those changes to occur. Now, first and foremost is mutation. Mutation are random changes in the genetic code. Now, the rate of this is only 10 to the -8, 10 to the -6 per genome per generation. This is extremely low rate. And so it is commonly misunderstood that mutation is a driving force in evolution. It actually isn't. But what it does is it introduces the variation for which natural selection and then genetic drift will act on. Now, migration. doesn't change the adaptive character of the genomes of the individuals, but the history of the New World, or what more effectively say Western Hemisphere, illustrates how quickly immigration can change allele frequencies in populations. Inbreeding refers to individuals of like genetic composition mating with each other. It doesn't change allele frequencies, but it does lead to increases in homozygosity, which is individuals having the same allele from their biological mother and their biological father. The phenomenon known as meiotic drive is extremely rare, and so therefore not worth talking about in our conversation. But natural selection is the only adaptive force that is leading to genetic traits that improve the survivorship and reproduction of the individuals who carry those traits. Now, also, since genes are aligned on chromosomes, genes that are close to ones that are under selection will also be increased in frequency. We call that linkage disequilibrium. Finally, genetic drift is a random change in allele frequencies due to small population size. It, again, is not adaptive, but it can determine the directions of evolution, and it played a major role in producing the genetic variability that we see in modern humans via the serial migration events which produced the populations that we now observe today. So now, in the United States, even though there's overwhelming evidence demonstrating that our species first evolved in Africa, the majority of Americans do not accept this science. For example, we did a survey of 1,655 adults, and we found that based upon an individual's self-identified race, region, age, and religiosity, most people disagreed with these facts. For example, 67.3% of whites disagreed, 60.9% of Hispanics disagreed, and 53.8% of Blacks disagreed with the scientific facts showing that humans first evolved in Africa and then migrated around the world. Now, the evidence for this migration is actually, again, I would say incontrovertible. I don't want to spend a lot of time explaining why this is true, but if there are questions about this, I'm happy to address them during the question and answer period. Now, one of the most important and easiest to demonstrate examples of why humans must have evolved in Africa is the loss of heterozygosity is linear with geographic distance from Africa, meaning that if we determine the number of individuals who have a different allele from their mother and father, and we do that in populations around the globe, we see that there's a clear linear decline. Now, this is basically a measure of the genetic variability of populations, with Africa having the highest heterozygosity because we began there and people lived there for the longest period of time, thus accumulating genetic variants. And then as people began to migrate around the globe, drift events led to the loss of genetic variants, with the least genetic variants being found in the Western Hemisphere. And I mean the indigenous populations of the Western Hemisphere. So, in the 20th century, the principles of natural selection and the principles of Mendelian genetics were unified in something that we call the neo-Darwinian synthesis. Now, prior to this, evolutionary biologists really could not explain the mechanisms of evolution. We knew that evolution had happened, but explaining how it happened was elusive. But with this unification, we were able to demonstrate exactly how gene frequencies changed in populations. And this, of course, allows us to better understand the genetic variation that we found and observed in our species. Now, the term subspecies, which is equivalent to geographical race, saw common usage in the late 19th century. But as we began to examine whether, in fact, we could unambiguously identify such groups within the human species, we ran into real problems. So here's a quote from Ernst Mayr, one of the architects of that synthesis, who said, "The concept of subspecies is fallacious. Species are not composites of uniform subtypes, subspecies, but consist of an almost infinite number of local populations, each in turn in sexual species consisting of genetically different individuals. The difficulties of the subspecies concept are intensified if one considers the subspecies not merely as a practical device of the taxonomists, but also as a unit of evolution. The better the geographical variation of the species is known, the more difficult it becomes to delimit subspecies, and the more obvious it becomes that many such delimitations are quite arbitrary." So in this statement, Mayr is saying that the human species is distributed continuously across the globe. And any attempt to try to decide where one geographical race begins and another one ends is essentially an arbitrary process. Now, we also know that human beings are remarkably like each other. So even though natural selection has occurred on some human traits during that great ancient migration across the planet, there was very little adaptation that actually occurred. And if you look at the kinds of things which natural selection did act on, I don't think anyone listening to this discussion today would be surprised. So there are examples of things such as skin pigmentation. In the tropics, individuals have darker skin. Okay? Our species first evolved in the tropics. As individuals moved into higher latitudes away from the tropics, they lost skin pigmentation. Adaptation to resist disease. So adaptations against malaria are things that natural selection acted on. Adaptation against trypanosomes, sleeping sickness. Adaptation to high-fat diets in the Arctic, and so on. But what is notable here is that while the human genome consists of over 19,000 protein-coding genes, the number of genes listed on this figure is only about 35, in which we show really strong evidence of genetic or evolutionary adaptation across the planet. That is a tiny amount. So what this indicates is that most of the genetic variation we see in modern humans was a result of genetic drift, random changes due to small population size, and were not adaptive. Also notably missing here are genes that can be clearly associated with traits such as intelligence or personality. We don't see any evidence of that. So now, most people can look at individual humans and say, well, this group of humans are different from another group. However, we can't actually classify humans in a consistent way using their physical attributes. So here is a tree of relatedness based upon general physical traits that was put together by Cavalli, Sforza, and Edwards in 1964. So I don't think anyone would doubt if I said that Swedish and French people look more like each other than they do any of the Aleut or Eskimo people. But you might have pause if I tell you that Aleut or Eskimo people look more like Swedish and French people than they do North American Indians. or that North American Indians look more like Swedish and French people than they do South American Indians. Okay? Our evolutionary history demonstrates that South American and North American Indians are descended from the same group that crossed over into the Western Hemisphere. Now, furthermore, if I told you that Papua New Guineans and Australian Aboriginal people physically look more like sub-Saharan Africans, you wouldn't doubt that either. In fact, on the slide, when I show this slide to my students and I ask them, where do you think this child comes from? They uniformly say that this is an African. Well, he's not an African, he's a Solomon Islander, which is in Malaysia, okay? Or, Melanesia. So here, physical traits do not give us an accurate representation of human genetic ancestry. And so therefore, we cannot use them as a means of classifying human beings into biological races. Now, if we actually look at the phylogeny of human beings based on genes, then what we see is that most of the genetic variability within our species currently resides within Africa. And then as individuals began to migrate out of Africa, phase 3 migration, you see more genetic variability lost. So we have people in the Middle East, East Asia, the Americas, and Australia, Melanesia. But the vast majority of our genetic variability is still found in the continent of Africa. And these physical traits that I discussed before are discordant with other physical traits. So, for example, if we look at skin color distribution, and again, we are speaking about indigenous populations, there's more skin color variation on the continent of Africa than there is in the entire rest of the species. Now, and that's because Africa passes through more lines of latitude than any other continental mass on the planet. So in the previous slide, you were looking at a Mercator projection, which exaggerates the poles and condenses the tropics. And here is a more accurate representation of land masses on our planet. And you can see that Africa is passing through the most lines of latitude compared to any other continent. Now, as I mentioned earlier, humans migrated, ancient migration was via small groups. They encountered new climatic conditions, new infectious diseases, and new diets. But we can still use modern techniques, or we can use modern techniques such as ancient DNA to determine what genetic changes were occurring during these ancient migrations. Here's one of the ones that most people find shocking. This is derived from a study of a 7,000-year-old Mesolithic European found at the Logroño Antero site in northern Spain. And we can demonstrate with ancient DNA that while some of this individual's genome was derived from new conditions in Europe, that individual still retained the ancestral alleles related to skin color from Africa, indicating that this individual was most likely dark-skinned. And in fact, more ancient DNA studies have accumulated over the last 10 years, definitively demonstrating that fair skin evolved really late in the history of our species, really no older than about 10,000 years old. So, and blonde hair is also a recent trait, only about 6,000 years old. And it is found in Northern Europeans, but it's also found in Melanesians. And the Melanesian gene is actually older than the European gene. And we find anti-malarial adaptation across the entire tropics. It is not just found in Africa. It is found in Southern Europe. It's found in the Middle East. It's found in India. It's found in Indochina. HbS, hemoglobin S, which is responsible for the disease known as sickle cell anemia, is found in Central Western Africa, but it's also found in Southern Europe. It's found in the Balkans. It's found in Saudi Arabia, and it's found in India. And we can show that allele frequencies of the HbS allele is actually higher in groups like Saudi Arabians and Greeks than it is in African Americans. Now, the reason for that is because over the last 100 years or so, the conditions that would have allowed the HbS allele to maintain its high frequency, that is malaria transmission, no longer exist in the United States. And so therefore, there is no advantage for a person who's a carrier of HbS. And so this reverts simply to being a deleterious allele, and natural selection eliminates deleterious alleles. And so while I'm not saying that sickle cell anemia is not still an issue in the United States, it is far less frequent than when the first enslaved Africans were brought to the Western Hemisphere. So, in short, the biological criteria for race fail in modern humans. And this is due to two criteria. First, the amount of genetic variation found within versus between groups, and whether any group of human beings can be considered a unique genetic lineage. So, to quickly explain how we can measure genetic variability within and between groups, we can use something called the population subdivision statistic, which was first devised by the American population geneticist Sewell Wright. Now, this statistic essentially looks at the amount of heterozygosity within the total species versus the amount of heterozygosity in its subpopulations. We can define the subpopulations any way we want to. So, for example, if we want to define subpopulation by continent, we can do continent. We want to do it within continental regions, we can do it within continental regions. So by this simple equation, we can measure that heterozygosity and determine the value of this statistic. The equation shows you that the maximum value that FST can take on is 1, and the minimal value it can take on is 0. Now, Wright reasoned that an FST greater than 0.250 would be evidence of strong genetic differentiation and therefore strong evidence for geographical race or subspecies existence. Anything below that says that essentially there hasn't been enough local adaptation to justify naming biological races or subspecies. So when we measure this in humans, we find that humans don't arise to the level predicted for the existence of biological races or subspecies. In other words, population subdivision in humans is extremely weak. Now, this study looked at only 24 genes and found that the FST value for those globally was 0.156, not even close to 0.250. But what's really interesting is comparing human population subdivision to that of other large-bodied mammals that exist on our planet. So human beings represent the black bar on the left-hand side of the graph. You will note that there are many mammal species that go to the right of our species, such as coyotes in North America, elephants in Eastern and Southern Africa, Okay, Grant's gazelle in Kenya. If you were to say that there were subspecies or biological geographic races in those species, you would be correct. In other words, you would have a much better argument to support that claim. However, human beings have very little genetic variability.
Todos se entreguen, continuamos con el proceso.
Mañana se termina todo. Va. Gracias.
Okay, could someone mute themselves? Okay, thank you. So now, furthermore, we can show that this FST statistic is distributed by geographic distance and that it's continuously distributed. So if we really had geographical or biological races, we would see discrete clusters of FST values along geographical distance. But we don't. We see continuous change in FST. So basically, this is a sophisticated way of saying that groups that live closest to each other share the most genes in common, and that sharing of genes in common is continuous with human distribution across the planet. Now, the colonization of the Western Hemisphere brought into existence new groups that had not existed before that colonization. African Americans are one such group. Okay, when we look at the genetic ancestry of African Americans in the United States, the average European ancestry that African Americans hold is 16%. Now, that average can differ dramatically depending upon the region of the United States where the individuals live. So in the Southeast, we are closer to the 16% average. But for example, in West Virginia, the mean European ancestry in African Americans is 30%. In Kansas, it's in the high 20s. In Washington State and Wisconsin, it's in the high 20s. So you cannot tell a person's European ancestry by simply knowing that they describe themselves as African American. And in fact, a study that literally came out 3 weeks ago from the National Institutes of Health USA, All of Us, further demonstrates that genetic ancestry and an individual's socially defined racial description don't match each other in the United States. Now, this is also true in Latin American populations. Now, if you look at the island of Puerto Rico, we have in Latin America a triad mixture of Amerindian indigenous people, African descent, and European descent. So in the island of Puerto Rico, the average individual has about 72% European ancestry, but 16% indigenous ancestry and 12% African ancestry. In Mexico, the national averages are more 51% indigenous population, 46% European, and only about 3% African. In Peru, it's 80% indigenous, 18% European, and only about 2% African. And the national average for Colombia is 64% European, 29% indigenous, and only about 7% African. But I want to make it really clear that within all of these nations, indigenous groups still survive. African descended groups still survive. For example, in Colombia, okay, the regional capital of Medellin, the ancestry profile of individuals there looks very much like that of the national profile. But in the neighboring state of Chocó, which was a site of gold mining and saw the importation of large numbers of persons of African descent, you see an average of African descent of those individuals on the order of that which you would see in the United States, 80, 85%, but with much higher indigenous ancestry in Chocó than you would see in the United States. And so while the data I presented before are showing national averages, it's very important to recognize that in all these nations, okay, indigenous populations, African descended populations, there are Afro-Brazilians, there are Afro-Bolivians, there are Afro-Peruvians, okay, still exist. So one should not confuse national average numbers with the non-existence of people who have maintained their ancestry for whatever reasons. Now, so long and short of it is that our species does not have biological races. We have, as I pointed out, geographically based genetic variation, but not enough to raise to the level of races. And furthermore, that our socially defined races do not match our profiles of ancestry. Now, this then leads to a question that I have been investigating for 30 years. If we don't have biological races, then why do we see these major disparities in the health of individuals by socially defined race? So in this, what am I looking at? In this slide, you see on the left-hand side, the age-specific profiles for heart disease and cancer, the ratio by socially defined race, where people of African descent or Black people, okay, show 2.5, close to 2.5 times the mortality of European descended people or white people, and about 1.5 that in cancer by age. We look at infectious disease such as influenza and septicemia. We see similar disparities. Now, this cannot be explained by genetic differences. Okay? So if we were to look at the genetic contributions to disease or any other physical trait, it is made up of genetic contributions, environmental contributions, gene by environment contribution, plus the covariance of genes and environment, plus error terms associated with how a trait is measured. Now, in some cases, the error terms can be very significant. For example, in the United States, a person of African descent is more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia when they're actually suffering from bipolar disease. So if you have errors of those kind, that's going to confuse your estimates of whether a trait or the degree to which genes are influencing a trait. But in general, I have shown, and I will give you many examples of this in the book that comes out in November, that the genetic difference is a small effect. So while we have larger differences in well-being and lifespan and mortality, the genetic effect is very small. The environmental effect, however, is large. The gene by environment effect is large. The covariance effect is large. And depending upon the disease in question, the error term is unknown. Now, should this be true? Well, if we look at the genetic foundations of these populations, it should not be true. So a study that was done now about 17 years ago looked at the genomes of European and African Americans to determine whether specific genetic variants were possibly bad or probably bad. So looking across the genome, they found that there was no difference between African Americans and European Americans in genetic variants that were possibly bad. But that when we looked at genetic variants that were probably bad, it was European Americans that had a higher number of variants that were probably bad compared to African Americans. So if genes were driving the health disparity differences we were observing, this pattern should have been the other way around. Now, this study could be criticized because it looked at a very small number of individuals, only a couple of thousand. However, the All of Us project has now looked at over 245,000 whole genomes of people of different socially defined racial groups. And when that is done, the results shown by the previous small study of 2008, this data was published in 2024, last year, holds up. In other words, persons of European ancestry have more clinically significant variants that are likely disease-causing than persons of African descent. But yet, the patterns of health disparity that I have shown persist in the United States. And furthermore, the new administration is making it impossible to study these patterns of disparity. Research grants since January of 2025 have been terminated that examine health disparities. The All of Us project has been dramatically cut back. My own training in genomics, cloud computing, data science grant will be terminated by that administration on June 30th. So while these health disparities are real, while the evidence shows they are not the result of some inherent genetic deficiency in persons of African descent, the new administration wishes to eliminate our ability to study why these problems exist, which of course I have argued are the result of historic and ongoing structural racism in the United States that differentiates its treatment of Black, Latino, and Indigenous people, and therefore leads to our premature deaths. So, there has been, or at least there was, movement to change the way we studied these problems in the United States. The National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, Medicine came out with a report on the use of population descriptors in genetics and genomic research in 2023. That report recommended that socially defined race really was not a proxy for the environmental causes of health disparities. And in my testimony before that committee on April 4th of 2022, I said, our social conceptions of race and ethnicity do not match the underlying biological and genetic variation within our species. And we should never confuse the things that were created for the purposes of oppressing people with the nature of that biological and genetic variation. So I will stop here and I will take any questions concerning my presentation.
Thank you so much, Joseph. This was an incredibly important, incredibly potent presentation. I don't have time to give a couple of kind of broad comments, Jimena and Olivia, before opening up the floor.
Sí, Sara,
Okay.
solo te queremos pedir, por favor, hablar un poquito más lento para facilitar el trabajo del intérprete. Eso es.
No problem.
Muchas gracias.
Okay. Thank you so much, Joseph. This was an incredibly wide-ranging talk. You covered a huge amount of ground. What I particularly appreciated about not just what you've presented today, but your work in general, is the great amount of care that you take to not try and segregate the biological from the social, but to present these complicating factors, try and disentangle where, where there might be confusions, where there certainly are confusions, where social conceptions of race are often mistakenly used to interpret biology and vice versa. And I think this is, it's always incredibly important, but I just think your work and your recent books in particular, I thought it was fantastic, the idea that you had with Alan Goodman of presenting your book together as kind of answers to frequently asked questions, because I think there are still, and as you pointed out in your presentation, there are still so many misconceptions about the concept of race, and so much that is not known. And I saw some people throwing up surprised face emojis in parts of your talk, because some of the genetic studies that you mentioned really are jaw-dropping, in the sense that coming from societies as we do that are so imbued with this racial common sense, which is taught to us from such an early age, so much of this seems counterintuitive. And I think it was, just to pick up on a couple of the things that you presented, the time scale of the things that you're researching. I love the slide where you reduced or kind of summarized the history of human evolution, of anatomically modern human evolution in the course of a calendar year, to see really the concepts when we're talking about social race. They're so new, they're so recent, and yet they have so thoroughly shaped the majority of our worldviews, particularly living, I come from the United Kingdom. Here in Mexico, there has been a recent, relatively historically recent tendency to imagine that race is not a phenomenon and racism is not a phenomenon. Here in Mexico, in the United States, it's always commented that race is always extremely present in political discourse, in education, and so on. But these are really such recent concepts when we're thinking about human evolution as a whole. So I really appreciate you taking the time to really lay that out with such clear examples. In a moment, I will open up the floor, because I'm sure there will be a huge amount of questions. But I just wanted to ask you at first a couple of things that kind of arose to me when I was reading the papers that you sent to us before this event. One of the things I particularly liked about your paper, Favored Races. Let me just find the full title, Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. You end that article with a couple of paragraphs where you talk about what, and this is, it's important to say, you published this in 2023, and the political situation has moved on incredibly just in the past 6 months. So I'm sure you have additional thoughts on what include, in addition to what you wrote a couple of years ago. But you mention a few effective measures that you think can be taken as an evolutionary biologist against the spread of racist misconceptions. So one of the things that you mention is how we teach concepts in evolutionary science in the classroom, so in a specialized context to the future evolutionary scientists. The second thing that you mention is bolstering public understandings of evolutionary biology and how that relates to social conceptions of race. And the third thing that you say is that the best palliative measure against the spread of racist misconceptions in evolutionary science is the transformation of the scientific workforce to accommodate the many dimensions of diversity that define human society. And I think we could say that in a different way. This could be, and you'll correct me if I'm misinterpreting you, but it could be a call to the importance of public policies that support increased diversity, equity, and inclusivity measures in universities. And I wondered if you could talk to us a bit more about those 3 points, or just one of those 3 points, if you want to just stick to them. What do you see as the challenges in your own life as an educator, the students that you encounter and the publics that you encounter, to dispelling the huge amount of racist misinformation that exists currently?
So to make a long story short, science is powerful because it provides us with an understanding of the way the natural world works. And how you think about what kind of science you're going to do is very much determined by your social position. So the universe, works the way it works, but how we as, human beings enmeshed in social contradiction, right? By, our gender, by our sexual orientation, by our religious background, by our socially defined race, how we decide to think about and investigate the world, is important, and it influences the way we interpret nature. Now, what we should be striving for is to be objective, but individuals are rarely, if ever, that. So the way that you get towards that objectivity is by having all the people in the scientific enterprise. But we've had a history of white male dominance of scientific research. And not surprisingly, so many of the results of that science have supported white male social hierarchy. I mean, again, maybe I'm wrong, but I think if we had more women, okay, and more people across the diversity of social definition of race doing the science, we would have more accurate science. And the needs of the people who have been oppressed within these societies would rise to the forefront. Because quite frankly, there are more oppressed people than there are oppressors. And so that's what I have been working for my entire career. And to give you an example of that, so North Carolina A&T, and I know for folks, in Mexico, this concept may be strange. We are a historically Black university. What that means is that after our Civil War ended and enslaved people like my ancestors were given their freedom, okay, one of the first things we worked for was to educate people who had been slaves. Well, white folks did not want us in their universities. And so we had to build our own. And so that's what my university is. Our historical mission has always been to uplift Black and other disenfranchised, under-resourced people into professions, originally in agriculture and then technology. But we've always had to work against a state that has never felt that we should be educated, has never wanted us to be at the tables, never wanted our priorities to be, considered. And so our institutions have been historically underfunded. No, so in the nature piece, I document that my university alone has been underfunded to the tune of $2 billion since 1930. So if they were to pay that $2 billion that we are owed, not $2 billion to bring us up with the other universities, but just give us the $2 billion that was owed to us. I've argued that we could change the demography of science in many disciplines within a decade. My research group alone has produced in the last 5 years 5 Black women PhDs in microbial evolution. That is more than the rest of the country has in 5 decades. Okay, and we have several more in the pipeline right now who are working on their PhDs and will finish. But now we have to deal with our research and training grants being canceled. So I have to tell students and postdoctoral researchers last week that you won't have a job on June 30th because the Trump administration has canceled our research and training grant. And the NIH told us that our work was no longer within the priorities of the National Institutes of Health. So you explain to me how genomics, data science, and cloud computing are no longer within the scope of the National Institutes of Health. The white institutions in America that have those training programs, they didn't lose their grants. So basically what you've said to us is that you don't want Black people learning those tools. So we are going to appeal and we are planning to sue them. And in fact, the news doesn't, in the United States, doesn't get to you at the rate which I don't get Mexican news. But Tuesday of this week, a federal district court judge in the District of Massachusetts ruled that most of those grant terminations were arbitrary and capricious and were void and therefore illegal. And in his judgment said that he had never seen an example of blatant racial discrimination by the U.S. government in his 40 years on the bench. So we have a white supremacist fascist regime that has now taken the leadership of the United States and is targeting people of color. But we will continue to fight. Okay, we will do everything in our power to resist this. So, yeah, that's what we're working towards. We're working towards a scientific enterprise that includes the voices of everyone, not just some people.
It's incredible to hear you say that. And yeah, just to, as you were speaking, a phrase popped into my mind because I spent a decade working with geneticists and genomicists and thinking about the racial politics of genomics. And the phrase that popped into my head is genetics is the study of diversity. The government is trying to erase notions of diversity from all official documentation, from science. But as you say, genomics and genetics as a whole haven't yet been cancelled, but it's,
let me tell you what they did cancel. So there was a web page at the Centers for Disease Control attempting to recruit people for clinical trials to increase the diversity of individuals who would be engaged in these clinical trials. the administration took down the webpage because the word diversity appeared on the page. Now, scientifically, you can't test drugs or medical devices on just a narrow segment of the human population, right? You have to expand. And particularly given that most of the genetic variability in our species is found in Africa, you want more Africans in the study, right? You want to oversample Africans because you're therefore more likely to find more genetic variation, which could be impacting the way drugs work. So they took it down because the word diversity was on the webpage. These are the idiots. I mean, and I will say it, that's exactly what we're doing. They're not just mean, spiteful, evil people. They're stupid. I'm sorry. They are stupid as well.
And at the same time, I'm seeing a lot of comments of people agreeing with you and thanking you for raising your voice on this. And the thing is, it's at the same time a testament to the danger that white supremacists and fascists see in this kind of work that you're doing, that the general work around anti-racism, that is really what is propelling this crackdown. So in a sense, it's also a clear signal that we're doing something collectively that is extremely powerful and necessary. I'm going to open up the floor now to some questions and comments. Por favor, si tienen preguntas o comentarios, pueden levantar la mano o postearlos en el chat, ya sea en YouTube o aquí en Zoom. I'm going to start with Olivia, but I'll keep an eye out for more comments coming in. Olivia.
Yes, thank you so much, Joseph, for this wonderful talk. I read your book with, I mean, particularly the book you wrote with Alan Goodman. I'm reading some other of your work, of your papers, and it's very interesting. I don't come from a field where I study the frontier between the life sciences, biology, genetics, etc., and the social sciences. I'm a historian, mostly a political, social, cultural historian. But my students have learned a lot by me explaining to them your book, and now this talk, I think, was even more even clearer. I think in many ways. So thank you very much. And I want to introduce maybe a little discussion in the sense that, as you said, there are no scientific basis to sustain that there exist human races. Okay, but in every country, as you also said, the social way in which we go about defining people by race or talking about races is very different in different countries. You mentioned some of those countries, and particularly in a country like Mexico, as you said, the state defined as a political category, in fact, the existence of mestizos as the essence of race, identity, and even national ethnicity. I mean, the ideal composition of Mexican population should be, according to the state, mestizo. Okay, but well, today 21% of the population claims to be indigenous, from different indigenous peoples. 2% of the population claims to be Afro-descendant. And this is the census asks people about their identity identification, not racial identification. And nobody in Mexico defines himself, herself as a mestizo, because in the census, that category does not exist. So it's by elimination. People who are not indigenous, who are not Black or Afro-descendant, and who are not foreigners are by definition mestizos, okay? But in this country, people don't talk really in terms of race. Not even the racialized people, the racialized groups. No, historically speaking, people in this country don't normally define themselves or others as part of a race. So this has complicated very much our research, because we have had to prove that there is racism, despite the fact that almost nobody defines himself, herself as part of a race. Not even the left, not even the groups who are victims of racism, okay? So this has been a very big challenge. And what I wanted to ask you, maybe, I don't know, I'm just introducing a question which maybe I don't know how you will take this, but in Mexico, there is a discussion. Some of the anti-racist scientists and movements or activists say we should identify as members of different races in order to fight against racism. That is one of the things that has happened. And another part of these anti-racism thought or activism says, no, it's not necessary to do that. I mean, we can fight racism without people having to identify as part of a race. Why can we do that? Because historically and culturally speaking in this country, that word, that concept has not had really social profound roots, okay? So this is a very big discussion. I know that in the United States, when people say, no, let's erase race, let's talk about we are all the same, and we have to build a world in which we will be not defined by race. I know that it is a flag of the right, because it's colorblind and it wants to erase a real profound social reality that people, ¿cómo se dice? Reivindica, claim.
Yeah, that people affirm or claim.
Claim as something they think is correct. But what happens in the context where that is not like that? We have been discussing, I mean, I'm just would like to have your thought about this. And another, I know that I talked very much, but we have time and I wanted you to know about this discussion. And another thing is that, you know, I don't know if all of the subjects of the scientific research are defined by the place that you occupy in society in terms, for example, of racialized people or people defined by ethnicity. Because like if you see research on nuclear physics, for example, or astronomy, I don't know if that would be, I mean, so much defined by the place you occupy in society, for one thing. And another thing I wanted to ask you is that I have now known, I know that the grants have been suspended, for example, for research in neuro surgery in Northwestern University. And it's the people who had these grants were not necessarily Black people or racialized towards the inferiority necessarily. Or, for example, nuclear theoretical physics has been canceled in Yale. The grants have been canceled. And even, biology, studying worms has been canceled in Smith's University and Smith's College. And people who are developing that science, those projects are not necessarily racialized, so I also think that fascists, and I want to know your point of view, fascists, as Trump, are anti-scientific, and they are anti-intellectual, anti-universities, anti-research. They are simply, as in Spain during the Spanish Republic, the extreme right said, intelligence has to die, and we will kill it. So what do you think about that? I mean, thank you so much.
Let me take the second one
Yeah.
issue first, because it's the easiest to respond to.
Okay.
I completely agree to you. Fascists must kill intellectual activity and critical thought, because their entire social program, right, is so clearly wrong that if you have people who are thinking deeply about anything, right, they can lead a movement to change the society away from fascist rule. So I completely agree with you. However, in the United States, okay, there's a clear pattern of grant determination that is racist, patriarchal, and anti-LGBTQ plus.
Okay.
Yeah, some grants in climate science are being canceled because they're opposed to climate science. They want to continue burning fossil fuels, right? So virtually all of these terminations have some association with this new, white supremacist, fascist, anti-intellectual regime's agenda. Now, the first question is one that I think requires, more thought, at least from me. I think, there are two aspects of how a scholar does their work. First is simply attempting to understand how the society works. So if you're a sociologist, you're a historian, you're a political scientist, you're simply trying to understand how the society works. Okay. And then there's a second dimension. Okay. If you are an activist and you want to address social change using your knowledge of how the society works, okay, then you have to decide what is the most effective strategy to organize people to carry out the social change you want to achieve. You have to meet the people where they are, not where you would like them to be, not where your, high caliber scholarly work tells you, oh yeah, well, everybody should take on a race now because my high quality scholarly work tells me that everybody actually is a race. No. If your goal is to change society, you need to intersect people where they are at. And if the majority of people in Mexico do not identify with a social definition of race, then I think it's sort of an irrelevant question. What needs to be worked out is what topics, what issues will the people unite around to make the social change that will make their lives better, that will take on these oppressive structures and change them so that, people are no longer discriminated against because of their skin color or by their, degree to which they adopt European culture or their indigenousness. So I think that that's your task. Your task is to, to intersect with the people and help them bring together an organization and an agenda that can make the change that can free them. Because that's what I would answer.
Thank you so much, very much.
Wonderful. We have a hand raised from Pepe, and after that, I'll read a comment with some questions from Perla. So go ahead, Pepe.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Professor Grace, it was a great pleasure listening to your talk. It reminded me of an exhibition I had the opportunity to attend at the Smithsonian 15 years ago called Race, Are We So Different? I think that exhibition is one where Professor Goodman, the co-author of your book, is a co-director. And I have two questions regarding that. First, were you related to the organization or dissemination of that exhibition? And the second is, are those strategies of popularization of genetic knowledge, which tends to be somewhat difficult to communicate effectively, a good strategy that you would recommend following here in Mexico, for example?
So, first and foremost, I did play a major role in helping to put together that exhibit, and various places where the exhibit was shown. In Minnesota, for example, I was on an electronic kiosk where people could walk in and they could ask a geneticist a question, and they would send it to me, and then I would type back an answer.
It was amazing.
I think education is always a good thing. And, exhibits and hands-on opportunities work, I think, a lot better than, textbooks. So to the degree to which you want people to learn about, human biological variation, I think those things are helpful. But again, it comes back to, what is your purpose, right? How will the Mexican people be helped by learning about the genetic variability of people all over the planet? I mean, yeah, it's a good thing to know, but if you have limited resources and time and energy, where should you put your efforts? I mean, I think that all these problems start locally. So I think you need to intersect with them with the issues that are impacting their day-to-day life. Is it, employment? Is it, police brutality? Is it corruption? You know, what are the things that the people are interested in solving? And the degree to which your scholarship can help them solve those questions. That's why I've always tried to be a community engaged scholar. Yeah, I do study these, high level questions, but I also try to relate to people where they are at and what they want to know.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
I loved the idea of you typing back to people's questions, like chat GPT avant la lettre, and much more accurate.
Yeah, I was real intelligence, not artificial.
Yeah, real intelligence, exactly. Okay, we have a comment and a couple of questions from Perla, which I'll translate from the chat. She says, Dr. Graves, many thanks for your presentation. In Mexico, racism is often hidden behind a narrative of mestizaje, which, although it supposedly celebrates mixture, has functioned as a project of whitening and of forced integration, which negates the existence and the rights of indigenous nations and African descendant populations. You've demonstrated that race has no biological basis, but you've also signaled that its social effects can be profoundly real and devastating. How could we also critically dismantle the ways in which the Mexican nation state has used mestizaje to deny structural racism and reproduce a colonial order? And along the same lines, how should we interpret the constitutional contradiction between Article 2, which recognizes cultural diversity, and Article 3, which insists that Mexico is a one and indivisible nation?
So, these are difficult questions. I will not in any way, trivialize the struggle that you are engaged in. So first and foremost, there are the indigenous people themselves. And again, it comes down to a question of, do they themselves want to retain their indigenous identity? And do they want that recognized by the state? And if that is true, then I think it is the job of all scholars to support them in that position and to point out, how the government's strategy is really one of, as you said, of attempting to create a white Mexico, as opposed to recognizing that Mexico was originally a place where, Indian people lived. And then, also saw immigration from Africa as well. For example, I don't know, I'm sure you guys know this, but very few people in the United States know that Los Angeles was founded by Afro-Mexicans. So clearly, if those groups are being oppressed and discriminated by this basically whitening strategy, then it needs to be resisted. But again, it comes down to how do you set the intellectual and, well, as practical movement away from the whitening of Mexico, because you're going to have to win the people who believe in this ideology away from it. And again, I don't know, how much the average person on the street, because you've spoken to the fact that most people don't even talk about race in Mexico. So there is, I'd say, consciousness that needs to be raised of how not talking about race is actually fostering racism, as it is in the United States with, as you pointed out, the the colorblind ideology in the United States. So again, this is work that you need to do, and I from my own experience, it is difficult work. And in any way that I can be of help in your efforts, I will do what I can. Because I know it's not easy. What you're attempting to do is not easy.
Thank you, Joseph. Si hay más preguntas, por favor, sigan, no dejen de escribir sus comentarios, sus dudas en el chat o levantar la mano si quieren hablar. I'm going to take advantage of the fact that there's currently no hands raised or comments to ask a question of my own. You mentioned in your reply, I think, to Pepe about the need to identify problems that matter here in Mexico, and whether the question of whether knowing about genomics is relevant or not. And one of the areas where genomic knowledge comes up a lot in Mexico is in relation to issues of hereditary diseases or complex diseases, and something that's extremely prominent here in Mexico is the so-called diabetes and obesity epidemics. And I think it's very much as in the United States, there is a great tendency to try and over-geneticize these conditions. And the kinds of explanations that get a lot of traction are the idea that this is down to a Native American genomic trait that used to be evolutionarily adaptive, but in the current modern food ecosystems has kind of turned against us. I think if I understood correctly, the person who proposed that explanation maybe a couple of decades ago then went back and said, actually, that got a lot of traction, but actually I don't think it's right. I wondered if you could talk a bit about that, perhaps comparing how discussions about those issues occur in the United States. And just as a footnote, as I said, I'm from the United Kingdom, and between the UK, the US, and Mexico, we have the unfortunate statuses of the most obese countries in our respective regions. In the United Kingdom, obesity, for example, is linked to usually to lower class status, and it seems very clear to me that this is very much a question to do with neoliberalism.
Tenemos un micrófono abierto. Perdón, Sara. ¿Alguien escuchó algo raro? Soy solo yo.
En mi
Sí, se
canal no.
escuchaba.
¿Tú no? Perdona por la interrupción.
No
¿Sí
worries.
se escuchaba?
Sí, sí se escuchaba.
Bueno, por favor, vamos a cuidar eso mientras reviso y perdón, que Sara continúe.
Yep, no problem. So I think an alternative explanation is that these are complex issues, but there is a very evident coincidence in Mexico with the rise in the incidence of diabetes and obesity and NAFTA. So yeah, I'd love to have your thoughts on that.
I have taken on this misconception in genetics for at least say 30 years. And it's one in which they, again, as you said, they are overemphasizing the genomic contribution. That was called the thrifty gene hypothesis. And that was an idea that had its day, and it was popular before we could do whole genome sequencing. And once we were able to do that, the whole thing fell on its face because it was clear that these complex diseases are influenced by many, 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 many different positions across the human genome, and very few of them, have very high contributions. So now, is there a mismatch between the way humans evolved and our current diets? Absolutely. We call this evolutionary mismatch. We evolved at a time of food scarcity. We were hunter-gatherers. We were active. To be able to feed yourself, you had to be active all the time. You had to be worried about dangers and so on. Now we have this agricultural diet. The agricultural diet is high in all the content that's bad for us and low in the things that keep us healthy. Okay. Now, if you argue that, okay, it's, one or a few genes, then it becomes very easy for the pharmaceutical industry to say, okay, we're going to fix you. Okay. We're going to figure out how we control these physiological pathways, and we're going to stop you from gaining weight. Now, I can tell you that some of these drugs are working really well in the United States. I'm taking one now. In the last 6 months, I've lost 35 pounds. So you can do it. Okay. But I happen to be a relatively well-paid, researcher, and I have excellent insurance. And so they pay for my medication, and I'm taking it and I'm losing weight. Poor people who don't have access to these medications, right, are not losing weight, and they're getting sick and they're dying sooner. So, of course, we could do this the other way around, which is we could change the environmental conditions which contribute to people overeating. Okay, so we could give people, for example, meaningful jobs that have good incomes. We could give people, safe, healthy places to live, right? We could provide people with access to nutritious and healthy foods. That's a different social program. Okay, and one in which the pharma companies don't end up, right, making billions of dollars off the drug they produce. And I argue that the latter strategy empowers the people who, again, are being victimized by the way society is set up. And unfortunately, my experience has been is that folks who are research scientists in these specialized fields are all thinking about the invention that they're going to come up with or the company that they're going to start, which is going to make them billionaires, as opposed to thinking about how we can empower poor and working people to protect their health. So again, it comes down to, what your goals are. If your goal is healthy people, genomics is really not the way to get it. Okay, if you want healthy people, it requires social transformation. Sure, we should still continue to do that work because it's good to have medicines that can treat disease. But if we lower the incidence of disease to begin with, then we have less to treat.
Thank you. Yeah, completely. There's a question from Alejandro in the chat, 2 questions, which I'll read to you. And Cristina briefly had her hand raised, so perhaps go to Cristina next. So Alejandro says, from your perspective and experience, how do academics and intellectuals influence public debate about racism? And second part of the question is, in your opinion, have social networks impoverished explanations about racism, or could they really help to give a greater dissemination to talks about this topic?
So let's talk about public intellectuals. They are, let me put it this way. There are plenty of public intellectuals, particularly in the United States, who are racists and who are promoting racism. And unfortunately, they are the ones who are being given access to the mainstream media. For example, Sally Seitel, who is a member of the American Enterprise Institute, a medical doctor. American Enterprise Institute is a right-wing think tank. She's a medical doctor, and she is writing all sorts of things saying that, medicine is becoming politicized to the left as opposed to what it really is, which is a bulwark of, right-wing, ideology and privilege. But her stuff is appearing in the papers, and stuff like I write isn't. So public intellectuals can have major influence on the narrative, but it's a question of, who the people who control the media are presenting. Now, in some sense, social media could be a palliative against the control by, the historical, capitalists who control big media. But in fact, it's been the exact opposite because, again, misinformation, false narratives are being amplified by social media platforms. So in the United States, for example, we had the QAnon thing, which spread out of control. And we have other examples. And again, the people who own these platforms are saying, we don't have an obligation, nor is it constitutional for us to control these false narratives. And if people are hoodwinked by them, it's not our fault. And I say BS. I don't know what the Mexican Spanish word for that is, but I say no. I mean, you do have a responsibility for allowing false information to propagate across the world. And you're doing so because it helps to maintain your position to keep people ignorant and misinformed. So, yeah, I mean, social media could do good things, but it's not.
Okay, I'm gonna check if Cristina still had a question. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. It's a comment, it's not a question, that's why I didn't raise my hand before. I just wanted to thank you very much. I really liked the text that you sent to us. I think they are really, really important, also really like clear, and also your presentation right now. I think you have shown the importance of science in the development of racism, but also all the potential of science in anti-racism. So that was actually the aim of this session, and the aim of this of all the sessions of this year, to think about the anti-racism, the efforts we can have from different perspectives, in this case from the scientific work. And I think also you have shown also the importance of racism in medical discourse, for example, and how all these ideas are incorporated in common sense by people in general, and then repeated by these by these people, but not only by them, but also by doctors, physicians, scientists who have or census, right? You also talked about that. All of that, I think one of the challenges is that doctors, for example, or even the census, have some authority for people. It's like the doctor said it, so so I have to believe it, right? So I think that is also very important, and that's one of the challenges we have, to try to think about diseases, to think about health, but try to think about it in an anti-racist way. And one of the ways is, of course, recognizing the consequences of racism in health also, but trying to discourage this reproduction of racist ideas and racist discourse. So I only wanted to thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you, Christina. And I am putting another reference in the chat that you might find extremely useful. Okay.
Thank you. There's a comment in the chat from Maori, which I'll read. It's in English. Dear Dr. Graves, your powerful statements resonate deeply with an unease that permeates the very halls I walk through at university, a sense that our frameworks are crumbling under their own contradictions. I'd like to ask, do you believe the human concept itself has collapsed under its own weight, that modernity's civilizational project has reached the limits of its capacity, not just as a theoretical crisis, but as a palpable shift in the air, in classrooms, debates, even casual conversations? Are we witnessing the first tremors of a new historical phase, one where these fractures become the grounds we stand on? Thanks for your work.
Wow. I'm just gonna say, wow. That was a very, very deep question. So, has modernity collapsed on itself? I think so. I mean, the neoliberal capitalist project is, has shown its fallacies. I mean, Marx said this a long time ago, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And this is exactly what we've seen over the 20th century. I mean, that is what's happening. And as I pointed out in Voice in the Wilderness, the final chapter was called The Evolutionary Science of Social Justice. And I started, with a concept that was really developed by Rosa Luxemburg, who said it's either now socialism or barbarism. And that's exactly what I think we are seeing in the world now, that barbarism is rising. When the president of the United States, don't get me started on this man, but when he can say, to people in Iran, unconditional surrender, and believe that they are going to do this just because he said it, and he places the entire human population at risk with that kind of irresponsible behavior. I mean, My wife and I were thinking about, how many people are going to die because of that late night tweet, unconditional surrender. These are people who have absolutely no moral center, and how this nation could have fallen for this whole, program, and elected that man back into the White House and given him power over the nuclear football. I honestly can't explain it. I am at a loss. My mind, and by the way, I predicted he would win too, but I'm at a loss to understand how the people in this nation could have fallen so far, how their fear and bigotry and hatred could drive their behavior to this level. So, I can't apologize for those folks because I've spent my entire life working against them, and I may, end my life because of my work against them, but I came to that conclusion a long time ago. But yeah, I mean, we are on the verge of extinction. But that is not, but hear me when I say this, that is not a reason to give up. Okay. Indeed, because things are as dire as they are, it is a reason to double down on our commitment to work, to use our minds to work to make the world a better place, to fight for justice. Okay. And I will do that for as long as I have breath.
Okay, we have another question, a hand up from Pascal, and after that I've got a comment and a question, I think, in the chat, which I'll read afterwards. Go ahead, Pascal.
Pues antes que nada, igual que lo han hecho previamente, muchísimas gracias por esta presentación y por los conocimientos que nos has compartido. Y a mí me gustaría preguntarte, yo me dedico a los estudios de género y al tema de la interseccionalidad, ¿no? Y de la importancia justamente de ver estos cruces en donde categorías como la raza y el género entrecruzan, ¿no? Desde los estudios de género existen investigaciones analizan la manera en la que el discurso científico ha construido la diferencia sexual de manera jerarquizada para legitimar el discurso de la superioridad masculina sobre la femenina. Por ejemplo, hay trabajos sobre el tamaño del cerebro, aludiendo si el tamaño del cerebro de las mujeres es más pequeño que el tamaño del cerebro de los hombres. Es decir, también desde el género, también desde el lugar de las mujeres, ese conocimiento situado, estamos interpelando por una ciencia que cuestione este tipo de conocimientos basados en el método científico, posicionan cierto tipo de agendas en cuanto a esta jerarquización de los seres humanos más valiosos o más inteligentes o más capaces. Y me gustaría preguntarte, en tu trabajo, ¿has visto alguna de estas cuestiones con respecto a la categoría género en la intersección con la raza? Por ejemplo, recuerdo el reclamo de mujeres panteras negras con respecto a el posicionamiento también de las necesidades particulares de las mujeres negras. Y me gustaría preguntarte si has identificado algún tipo de tensión con la categoría de género en la intersección con la categoría.
Did you get all of that, Joseph? There was hubo un poco de interferencia, Pascal, pero were you able to hear the question, Joseph? If not, I can.
I heard it in Spanish, not in English.
Okay. Okay. So the Pascal is from the Center of Gender Studies at the UNAM, and she was asking whether in your work you'd come across the intersections between gender and race with the themes that you're studying, that you're interested in. And she mentioned that she was recalling the complaints of the Black Panther, women in the Black Panthers about the sexism that they experienced that was often not attended to by their male counterparts, and she wondered if you had encountered that in your work, and if you could comment on that.
Yes, absolutely. I have encountered that. Patriarchy is rampant, okay, is one of the first oppressions that existed within human society. And for me, any movement forward for human liberation has to attend to all of these oppressions. Now, at any given time, a particular form of oppression may be the most important thing to deal with, but it cannot, say that, oh, we deal with racism and it is entirely okay for women to, continue to be sexually harassed and abused and or, paid less for the work they do and all the things that happen in patriarchal society. So I am completely in 100% agreement that we have to move forward together and we have to pay attention. For example, in the United States, the most dangerous thing to be in the United States is a transgendered Black female. The murder rates, I'm quoting here, I may be wrong, I think it's 60 times higher than any other group in the United States. And then the next most dangerous thing to be is to be a 13-year-old African-American female. It's 13 times higher than the murder rates of European American females. So yeah, these issues are, of course, issues of class, gender, sexual orientation, race. And we have to build societies that protect every aspect of everyone's identity, not just one.
Thank you. I'm going to read a comment from Osorio in the chat, and they say, in relation to Perla and Pascal's questions, I'd like to add that discrimination or racism in Mexico manifests by mixing with the idea of social class, and assuming that whoever exerts power or who has access to privileged resources should desirably be white or whitened and of privileged class status. The rejection of those who don't meet these ideological requirements is very often, and it's very common, and that is a challenge that needs to be dealt with by Mexican academics, which is to demonstrate that these ideas are racism in a country that supposedly has no races. In a country that has no races, and also that whoever exercises political or economic power or has access to those resources could be someone who's not Western or not from a privileged class, without that condition minimizing their effectiveness. And continuing from the comments that and they're thinking of this in light of the recent comments that critique the new Indigenous president of the Supreme Court here in Mexico, or the president of Mexico who is a woman and politically on the left. All of those people are absolutely discriminated against based on their racial condition or their gendered condition, which, according to their critics, make them unfit for their charge.
Again, I cannot disagree with anything that was just said. In other words, we have to change the narrative. And the rejection of white supremacy is an essential part of changing that narrative. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know what you want me to say other than I completely agree with what you just said.
Absolutely. I want to, there's a hand up from Olivia. I'm just going to shoe in a small question, which is, you talked earlier about public intellectuals and the fact that often the voices that get through to the general public are people who are racist. But I wanted to ask you about how anti-racism is going amongst the ranks of evolutionary biologists, because, yeah, I mean, at the beginning of the 2000s, there were these great declarations that the Human Genome Project had shown that there are no races, and yet what followed very quickly after that was a huge amount of discussion in the genetic and evolutionary biology literature about whether actually genomics was showing that maybe race did have a biological definition, or biological significance, and this has been very prominently taken up by journalists. You mentioned in one of your papers Nicholas Wade, a New York Times writer who had this frankly awful racist book, but I feel that perhaps things changed maybe during the pandemic. There was a moment where a lot of the big associations and journals brought out anti-racism statements, and some of them have said much to the effect of what you said in your papers, that scientists need to stand up and be explicitly anti-racist. But from your own experience, I'd love to know how you feel this is going.
Yeah, so let me say this. One of the things that non-scientists have a tendency to do is to paint all disciplines with the same brush. And that is, again, because it's not your field and you're not familiar with the disciplinary differences, particularly in training and orientation. So in my field, which is evolutionary genetics, no credible evolutionary geneticist thinks that human beings have biological races. Now, in medical genetics, which is a field that has been really refractory to evolutionary thinking, there are still people who think that the socially defined races are in fact legitimate biological units. And I personally have been working against that misconception for a number of years. The last 3 to 4 years, and my colleague, Dr. Andrea Dayrup, who's a pathologist from Duke University, have spoken at over 80 grand round lectures at leading American, Canadian, and UK, British medical schools, dispelling that false notion. So now, have there been people like Nicholas Wade who've written books, people like, what's his name, Charles R. Murray, who's written a book on human diversity, basically recounting all these racist ideas? Yes. But if you were to ask, researchers who do work on, human genetic variation, nobody thinks that humans have biological races anymore. Okay. Now, some of them may think that, genetic variation, which is relevant to disease or intellect, are localized in populations. And so, yeah, there's some of that still. But again, no credible scientist holds that position. And, people like Wade and what's his name? Gosh. And Murray won't face me in public. Okay. Murray actually had the opportunity to debate me one-on-one on this very issue in 2016, and he refused. We're in the same building, in the same room. He could have, presented that view, and he knew better because he knew he didn't have a leg to stand on. But the problem, of course, is that when you get a few people like this Khan guy who writes a blog, and another one, Jerry Cohen, they write these blogs and present these views, the public doesn't have enough scientific sophistication to know that they're nonsense. And so that's why those of us who do need to be, again, in the public, presenting the alternative view. Of course, the difficulty when you live in a racially stratified society is that people's everyday common experience goes against the science, right? They see that Black people, have more illness. They see that Black people have less money. They see that Black people have lower educational attainment, and they immediately jump to a genetic determinist explanation for that, rather than accepting that they live in a structurally racist society. Now, why is it easier to jump to genetics? Because then they have no responsibility to make change. If once you accept that a society is structurally unjust, if you're an ethical person, you now are called to take action to change those unjust structures. So it's a whole lot easier to accept genetic explanations, because then the individual has absolutely no responsibility to take any action to make things right. And again, that's where scholars, that's the work we have to do to demonstrate that we're dealing with structural social attributes and not individual genetic or racial genetic composition.
Yeah, thank you. And following up on that, I feel that taking your own trajectory kind of as an example, in my work, one of the perhaps the disadvantages that I see that, and I would say particularly white geneticists in places like the United States, or I also worked on Brazil, I would say there as well, are often asked to weigh in on issues that are really political and structural issues to do with race. And although they have very interesting things to say about evolution and about the biology of diversity, often they're not that equipped, I think, to understand when really we're talking about something that is political and social. And in your trajectory, I read a wonderful article in Science Now, which gave a bit of your biography, and it's very evident that from for all of your life, you've had to deal with racism, that you made that part of your life's work, as you said, but you also, I think it said in this article that you particularly were inspired by reading Darwin and Marx, and that's not everyone, right? It's also something to have real class consciousness and a sense of the intersectional nature of these social issues. And I feel
Sarah,
that really...
I'm just going to break in here. It's easy to have class consciousness when you work beside your mother in a plastics factory when the temperature is, 95, 96 degrees, and you're choking on, plastic fumes, and everybody in that factory is Black or Latino. But it's very easy to develop class consciousness. Of course, I was born, working class, poor. My first memory that I remain in life was as a toddler, and going to the refrigerator looking for food, opening up the refrigerator and only seeing a bottle of water, and there was no food. Okay, so that's the life that I led. Okay, my parents decided to live in the town that I grew up in because it had excellent public schools. But I went to school with the kids who my mother was a maid. She cleaned their houses. My father worked in the lumber yard to make their homes, you know, build them and make them nice, and to clean the streets for them. Okay. And none of them believed that I had the capacity to be anything other than a laborer. They tried to, if you read the book, they tried to diagnose me as mentally retarded because I wouldn't sit in my seat. Now, the reason I wouldn't sit in my seat is because they gave me work, and our work was structured by the presumed intelligence of the children. It was called tracking. So I was placed in the lowest intelligence group, and everybody in it was Black or working class white. Okay. So I wouldn't stay in my seat. Well, the reason I wouldn't stay in my seat, I'm a 6-year-old little boy. I finished my work. All the other kids are still working. I finished my work. And how many 5 or 6-year-old little boys do you know who will stay in their seat when they have nothing to do? So they decided that they were going to put me in, you know, mental retardation, severely developmentally delayed class. And my mother, to her courage, came to the school and, I don't know if you use this term in Mexico, pitched a fit. Okay, she pitched a fit. You're not putting my son in that class. It's because your work doesn't challenge him. So, and again, I'll tell you this story. It's 3rd grade. I'm in the library. Okay, we had a library period, and I'm reading a book by Harold Lamb, who was a preeminent historian of the Crusades. This book was used in college history classes. I'm 8 years old. I'm reading this book. The other teachers assumed that I opened these big books because I didn't know how to read and I was showing off. The other kids were reading, you know, 3rd grade readers, Fun with Dick and Jane. So a student teacher who was new to the school came down and sat next to me, and she said, "Little boy, what are you reading about?" And then I proceeded to tell her about the history of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Crusades, why they occurred, who are my favorite characters, what the issues were. The next day, I went to a new classroom, and that was the advanced learning class. And the rest, they say, is history. If this young woman hadn't had the courage to go to the administration and say, "Look, you've seriously, you know, misrepresented this child. You need to put him where he can learn. You guys may never have met me."
We're all thankful to that teacher in that moment in the library, because, you know, this has been an absolutely wonderful session. I think I can speak for everyone to say, you know, your work is incredibly important. We're really grateful for you taking the time to share your experience with us, and once again, many congratulations. And also from Mexico, we are sending you solidarity, because it's a tough time.
We will continue the fight here.
Yeah.
Okay. We are outnumbered, and things are definitely dire. I'd be lying to you if I told you that they're not.
Mm-hmm.
So
I have a couple of last comments that have just come through in the chat, and I don't know if Olivia, you still wanted to say anything, but
No, I'm sorry. I wanted to answer Osorio here, but then I decided to write. And then I wasn't able to write because I was fascinated by what Joseph was telling us. So I'm sorry. I think I won't have time to answer that, but it's not important. Thank you.
Okay, I'll read these last two comments. So Bedla says, Dr. Graves, many thanks for sharing your personal experience. I felt especially moved because in Mexico we have similar situations. I think of the case of Lila, a Nahuatl young girl whose family decided to raise her in her maternal tongue as a form of cultural resistance and a way of reaffirming their identity. However, at her school, which paradoxically is a bilingual school, her teacher suggested that she could have some kind of neurological disability simply because she didn't speak Spanish fluidly. Her family, like yours at that time, is battling so that the school system will recognize that there is no deficit. What there is a political and cultural choice. This situation reflects just as much, reflects how the educational system in the US as in Mexico tends to pathologize what doesn't fit into the hegemonic model, what is urban, which would be urban, white, and monolingual. So thank you for demonstrating that behind these labels, there are racist structures that we need to continue dismantling. And there's another comment from Osorio, who says, Dr. Graves, thank you for such an interesting presentation. I live in the Netherlands and I work with children from poor neighborhoods, and their story is the same one, and your story is the same one that I see every day with these children who are of Arab and Caribbean and African origin. In this system, they very quickly put children, work out a place for these children in the system, and they put them at a level which they'll stay in later on. And the amount of children from these origins that are classified as unable to follow a high level of education is enormous. And just a final comment from Alejandro, who says, Dr. Graves, thanks for this presentation. So I think this is perhaps a good place to leave this. Do you have? And I want to give you the opportunity to have a final comment, Joseph, if you'd like to.
So only comment I'm going to make again is thank you wholeheartedly for inviting me to be with you today. There is a great need for international collaboration between scholars who understand how the world really works and who have the courage, to stand and to resist these injustices. And I mean what I say. I appreciate, your offers of support for us in the United States in this moment, which is grave. But I also will reiterate my pledge. If you need me, never hesitate to ask, because this is what I believe in. This is the work that must be done. And the more of us who do it, the better we network across the globe, the greater is our chance of success.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Joseph. Thank you to everyone for being a part of this. I don't know if Jimena or Olivia, you have a final comment.
I just want to thank Joseph for his really amazing generosity. Maybe we will look for you another time. And yes, we agree. It's a fight. It's a difficult fight. It has many angles to this fight. There are many angles to this fight. And there are many ways of going about it, but we really need each other. And we are really worried about what happens in the United States, not only in the United States. We're worried about what happens here also. It's not the same, and we are very worried about what happens in many other latitudes of this planet. And we must be together. It's true. So thank you very, very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Hopefully
very
we'll see you
much.
in Mexico someday, soon.
muy bien.
Thank you very much. Thank you also, Sara. Y muchas gracias a todas y todos que nos acompañan.
Gracias, Sara.
Gracias,
Gracias
Sara.
a todas y
A
todos.
Luis,
Hasta
a
la
Jimena,
próxima.
Olivia. Un abrazo.
Con
Muchas
gusto.
gracias.
Muchas
Saludos.
gracias.
Chao,
Un abrazo.
chao.
Nos vemos en agosto.
Gobierno de México.